Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to my fourth video in the Revolution Software retrospective. In my previous videos, I've talked about Lure of the Temptress, Beneath a Steel Sky, and Broken Sword, the Shadow of the Templars. If you haven't watched those yet, I suggest you do so before watching this one, or at least watch the Broken Sword 1 review, as I will be mentioning it throughout this video since comparing 2 to 1 is almost unavoidable. After the great success of Broken Sword, The Shadow of the Templars, a sequel was inevitable. Broken Sword 2, The Smoking Mirror, was released in 1997, 1 year after The Shadow of the Templars. It was published by Virgin Interactive on PC and Sony Computer Entertainment and Crave Entertainment on PS1. Sadly, there was no GBA port. Joking aside, apparently there were plans to release it on GBA, however it was cancelled due to funding and time limitations. It seems that Virgin weren't too keen on publishing this game in general, as they felt there was no money in adventure games anymore. Because of that, Revolution were given just 1 year to develop the game and only half the budget they got for Broken Sword 1. Sadly, that had an effect on the game. Though it was a commercial success, having sold 750,000 copies in the first 3 years after its release, it wasn't as well received as the first game. Many critics considered it a step down from Shadow of the Templars. I'm not sure I agree though. Whilst I think its story is a huge step down from the first game's story, I still think it was a pretty good adventure game, and many aspects of it are on par with the first game, which was quite impressive considering how little its resources were in comparison. I truly believe that if it had the same development time and resources Broken Sword 1 had, it could have been a great sequel. You can see that a lot of heart went into it, and you can tell that they did their best with what they had. Heck, it even had a few improvements over the first game. So join me as we talk about these improvements and talk about what prevented it from being the sequel Shadow of the Templars deserved. Spoiler warning. I will be spoiling a lot of things in this game, including major plot points. In my previous video, I tried my best to keep story spoilers to a minimum, but I don't think it's possible with this one, as I have many things to talk about regarding this game's story. In order to do so, I will inevitably have to spoil the game's plot. So if you haven't played the game yet, I suggest you do so before watching this video. The game may not be as good as the first one, but it's still worth your time and money. You should also play the first game, since I'll probably spoil some puzzles from that one as well. And just like with my previous video, I'll be playing the original PC version on ScumVM, not the remastered version. So without further ado, grab a drink, sit back, and enjoy the video. First off, let's talk about the graphics. The game is beautiful, especially the sprite work. It's very clear, and I think it was much better than the first game. Not to mention, George finally got a new outfit, and I'm so happy for him. When it comes to the animation, I'm happy to see that there was no downgrade, and in some cases, it's even better than the first game. Although I haven't seen any specific part that is better than this one, overall the game's animation is excellent. The backgrounds are gorgeous. I wouldn't say they're as beautiful as the ones in Broken Sword 1, but they suit the sprites much more this time around. For some reason, I always felt that the sprites in Broken Sword 1 didn't quite match the backgrounds, but it never bothered me. In Broken Sword 2, however, the characters look like they're part of the backgrounds, and I believe that's because the colors are much more vibrant and less realistic, which is not a bad thing. In fact, I quite like it. I may not want to frame any specific background and put it on my wall, but I can definitely say that the game is a joy to look at, and in some cases it even looks prettier than the first one. Most of the people who worked on the first game's visuals also worked on this one, along with some new faces, so it's no surprise that the game turned out to be so beautiful. It may not be prettier than the first one, but it's not lesser either. It's just different. When compared to general cutscenes in Broken Sword 1, such as this one, Broken Sword 2's cutscenes are a clear upgrade. Sadly though, the intro and outro cutscenes are nowhere near as good as the ones in Broken Sword 1, which is a shame. I would have loved to see something similar done with Broken Sword 2's setting. And if I were to point out another nitpick, it would be this cutscene. They attempted to make a stylistic cutscene for the story of Tezcatlipoca, like they did with the first game for the story of the Templars, but I feel like they didn't go all the way. They could have made a cutscene using art found on Mayan pottery. Instead, they just went with this simplistic approach, which isn't bad. It just doesn't go all the way like it could have. This is not a flaw though. Let's not forget that they were pressed on time and finance. Luckily, these limitations did not affect the music's quality, as the music in this game is unsurprisingly brilliant. Once again, the late Barrington Feilong delivers a beautiful soundtrack. And just like with the first game, he created many event-specific cues.
There was an arc-shaped scratch on the floor, as if a door had been opened in the nearby wall.
His music makes this game still feel like a Broken Sword game, whilst giving it its own atmosphere. And I think he nailed the Mayan feel.
What do you make of this dart?
I remember a case where the victim was killed with just such a device.
I also really like the new rendition of the game's original theme. The visuals and music in this game are on par with the first game. Different enough to make it stand on its own, yet similar enough to remind us that this is, indeed, a Broken Sword game. Sadly, the same can't be said about the game's story. In my previous video, I talked about how much I loved the story of Broken Sword, The Shadow of the Templars, saying that its subject was quite revolutionary and that it was responsible for my love of history in general. It was complex, unique, and very well constructed. Broken Sword 2, on the other hand, took a very different approach. The story is simple, formulaic, unorganized, and relies heavily on chance, prophecies, and subplots that go nowhere. It isn't really that bad, but it's not what I'd call good either. Before talking about my issues with the story, here's a quick run-through of the game's plot. 6 months after the events of the first game, George came back to France to reunite with his now girlfriend, Nico. She was about to meet a Professor Ubier to discuss a Mayan artifact she came across whilst investigating a drug smuggler called Karzak. Once they reach Ubier's house, they get ambushed by 2 guys who tie George and kidnap Nico. George manages to escape, and after a bit of investigating, he finds the location Nico was taken to and rescues her. Curious as to what Karzak wants with the stone, they set out to Quaramonte City, their only lead so far. After getting caught snooping around, they're forced to run away from the city, but whilst on the river, their boat gets destroyed. George wakes up in the jungle and finds that Nico is suffering from a snake bite. A priest who has been living in the jungle for a long time tells George that there's a nearby village that has the antidote. He goes there and the shaman tells him the story of the Mayan stone George is holding. A long time ago, the evil god Tezcatlipoca dethroned the good god Quetzalcoatl. A group of Mayan priests have managed to trap Tezcatlipoca inside a mirror. However, since he's too powerful, the mirror can't hold him forever, and he'll be able to escape by the end of the 5th age. So they fashioned 3 obsidian stones with enough magic to keep him locked up for all eternity. Unfortunately, before they were able to use them, the stones were stolen by Spanish invaders. George and Nico have 1 stone. Now they need to find the remaining 2 in order to stop Tezcatlipoca from escaping during the upcoming solar eclipse, which marks the end of the 5th age. Karzak, on the other hand, is looking for these stones so that he can throw them into the ocean. He wants Tezcatlipoca free because Tezcatlipoca has spoken to Karzak in his dreams and has promised him infinite power if he helps him escape. And that's the gist of it. Is it bad? Not really. Is it as good as the first game's story though? Absolutely not. Broken Sword 1's story was so brilliant it could have passed for a novel. In fact, a novel based on it already exists. Broken Sword 2's story is less like a novel and more like a popcorn flick. It's just mindless fun. I wouldn't have minded that if it was any other game, but a sequel to Broken Sword 1? It's just disappointing. And it's not just because it's simple. I have a lot of issues with the story, and one of them is the over-reliance on chance. Lobino is the one who suggested that Nico should ask Ubiye about the stone, and it turns out that Ubiye is working for Karzak, and Lobino had no idea. So was it just a coincidence that he suggested the one archaeologist that happens to work for the bad guy? Also, whilst Ubiye does work for Karzak, he had nothing to do with Nico's kidnapping. So how fortunate it was that his bank statement led George to Nico's kidnappers. In the 16th century, Captain Frederick Ketch took one of the stones that were taken by the Spaniards and hid it on a remote island along with his other treasures. He used the Bible verse, Mark 10:25, as a clue to where he hid it. From that, George was able to extrapolate that this mountain and this needle rock are the camel and needle referenced by Ketch, and that if he stood on this mountain and looked towards the needle rock, he'll be able to find the cave Ketch hid his treasure in. Not only was that an incredible stretch, as Ketch didn't even mention a cave, so for all George knew, it could have been buried anywhere in the line of sight. But he also finds the treasure still there, untouched for centuries. The mountaintop had Ketch's initials and 3 holes made specifically for tripods, so I find it hard to believe that no one was able to find this treasure before. It's not like the island never had any visitors, they were even shooting a movie there, for crying out loud. The 3rd stone was taken back to England by Sir Francis Drake, so it was a very happy coinkydink that the stone was at the first museum Nico decided to check out. Not only that, but she arrived at the museum mere minutes before Ubiye stole the stone. Visiting Quaramonte ended up being just a segue to get George to the Mayan village. If their boat wasn't destroyed and Nico wasn't bitten by a snake, they wouldn't have known about this village and wouldn't have learned the story behind this stone. Oh, sorry, this one wasn't actually a coincidence. It was a prophecy. I'm not a fan of prophecies in stories. To me, they're just a lazy tool to avoid giving the protagonists a good motive or to avoid writing a good reason as to why they ended up in the right place at the right time. The game also has a few subplots that went nowhere. For example, during their stay in Quaramonte, they heard a lot of talk about a mining accident that caused the death of 30 workers. You even talk to one of the survivors of said accident. You find out that it was actually intentional sabotage that was caused by General Graciento and Professor Ubiye, but that's about it. This whole accident is not mentioned ever again, and was only used as an excuse to convince the owner of this mining company to lend you her detonator. Which ends up being useless, might I add.
Here we go!
Too late.
Are we dead yet?
There's also this weird subplot about how Ubiye was suspected of murdering his wife, who was a famous actress. Later, we find out that Karzak is the one that killed her and he pinned it on Ubiye. He then got Ubiye hooked on drugs so that he'd help Karzak find the 2 remaining stones. First off, this plan is stupid, and it could have easily gone wrong. Ubiye could have been convicted and imprisoned, or Karzak could have failed at getting him hooked on drugs. Second, the only reason this subplot exists is to give Ubiye a reason to work for Karzak. I mean, couldn't it just have been as easy as, he's paying me lots of money to do this? We barely see Ubiye throughout the game, so what's the point in trying to make us feel sad for him when he dies? Also, why is Karzak so fixated on finding all 3 stones? All he needed to do was throw one of them into the ocean, and that would render the other two useless. If he hadn't kidnapped Nico, giving her the impression that he desperately needs that stone, she probably wouldn't have cared about this whole thing. In fact, he could have let the real Ubiye meet her and lie to her about the importance of the stone, and she would have just thought that someone sent it to Karzak by mistake. Seems like Karzak didn't think this through. One of the biggest reasons I loved the first game was how much history info was in it. It taught us a lot about the Templars, the Assassins, and even real historical figures such as Jacques de Molay, Philippe IV, and Pope Clement V. Broken Sword 2 has none of that. What annoys me is that there is a part where Ketch's descendants tell you about his history. This could have been interesting if it weren't for the fact that Captain Frederick Ketch doesn't even exist. The game relies more on mythology, which would have made up for the lack of history if it weren't for how bare bones the mythology info was in this game. All we know is that Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca are gods, and that they are rivals. Which, by the way, isn't even a Mayan story, as Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca are from the Aztec pantheon, not the Mayan pantheon. Come to think of it, why didn't they use Aztec mythology instead? Recently, I read a lot about Aztec mythology, and I think the Aztec creation myth, the Five Suns, would have been a perfect backstory for this game. Especially seeing how the game references the end of the Fifth Age and focuses on the significance of the solar eclipse. If you've never heard of the Five Suns legend before, I highly suggest you go read it. In the next 3 minutes, I will be giving you a summary of this legend and how I would have tied it to my version of this game's plot. My very own fanfiction, if you will. You can skip this part if you want by going here. There are multiple versions of this myth, but this version is my favorite. Long story short, these four major Aztec gods, Tezcatlipoca, Quetzalcoatl, Huitzilopochtli, and Xipe Totec, created all the other gods and created our world. And every time they create people, a god or goddess sacrifices themselves to become the sun. The first sun was Tezcatlipoca. This world was destroyed when Quetzalcoatl struck Tezcatlipoca out of the sky, which angered him, causing him to order his jaguars to eat all the humans. The second sun was Quetzalcoatl. This world was destroyed when Tezcatlipoca turned all the humans into monkeys, which angered Quetzalcoatl, making him send hurricanes to blow them away. The third sun was Tlaloc. This world was destroyed when Tezcatlipoca seduced Tlaloc's wife, Xochiquetzal, which caused him to wallow in grief, refusing to make the sky rain, which caused a horrible drought. People kept pleading for rain, and after having enough of their cries, he made the sky rain fire on them. The fourth son was Tlaloc's new wife, Chalchiotlicue, who was beloved by her people. This world was destroyed when Tezcatlipoca accused her of faking her kindness to gain the people's love. She was so saddened by his words that she cried blood for 52 years, causing endless floods and drowning all humans, forcing them to turn into fish to survive. This brings us to the fifth sun, which is our current sun. The fifth sun is Huitzilopochtli. He's doing such a good job as the sun that the Tzitzimime, the monstrous goddesses of the stars, became jealous of his brightness. Led by the moon goddess, Coyolxauhqui, they wage war against him every night, and are pushed back by Huitzilopochtli's brightness every morning. However, during the solar eclipse, they become more powerful, and they attack the sun during the day as well. And since this game has an upcoming solar eclipse, they could have tied it to this myth. Instead of Tezcatlipoca, its Papalotl, the leader of the Tzitzimime, could have been the villain of this game. The Tzitzimime have the ability to possess humans during the eclipse, so this could have been used as a plot device. Its Papalotl could have possessed Nico and convinced the unaware George to help her get a specific artifact from Karzak. After he does so, its Papalotl reveals her true self, and it turns out that that artifact was what she needed to defeat the sun. And Karzak turns out to be a good guy that was trying to keep her from getting this artifact. He helps George and Nico find its Papalotl and stop her from destroying the fifth sun. With the help of the other gods, they manage to defeat her and save the world.
Get real, George.
Look, I'm just spitballing here. But I think this plot would have given the game a lot more space to explore the mythology and history of its subject. Because as it is now, the game just doesn't do much with what it had, which is quite disappointing. Even the writing took a hit. Most of the characters in Broken Sword 1 were unique and well written. Important characters such as Inspector Rosso and Condesa de Vasconcelos had a very interesting arc. And minor characters like Lady Piermont and Nijo were fun characters that had entertaining conversations. In Broken Sword 2, on the other hand, the characters are very one-dimensional and extremely generic. Even returning characters are a step down from before. In Broken Sword 1, Lobino was a helpful, down-to-earth guy who had a bit of a creepy interest in Nico.
Hi, André. Hello, Georgie.
Here, he's just a total douche.
Every time she gets involved with you, there is trouble. Walking out on her was the best thing you could do.
And I don't like George in this game. He's nowhere near as lovable as he was in the first game.
What do you think this is, Andre?
I don't know.
I'll give you a clue. It's got more backbone than you.
You think you're amusing, don't you?
He's always been a bit sarcastic, but he was still level-headed, nice, and his goofball nature was adorable. In this game, however, he's just mean.
I wasn't going to waste my breath on that drunkard.
What I'm saying for the kids on the street.
Which is what? I'm crap, I'm going nowhere?
This isn't sarcasm anymore. This is just being rude for rudeness' sake.
What's wrong with beans and beer?
You need me to tell you? You're pumping out enough methane here to fill a dirigible.
It's one thing to insult thugs, but to insult a guy who's just doing his job? Also, what's with all this animal cruelty? He dunks a dog into disgusting and probably extremely cold water. He calls a cat a monster for no reason and fantasizes about kidnapping it. And he immediately resorts to shooting this baby wild boar with a poisoned dart, without even considering an alternative solution. The writing isn't bad, but it's a huge step down from the first game. I mentioned in my previous video how the first game had a bit of unnecessary fluff, but I also mentioned how it was well written, so it wasn't much of an issue. But the writing in this game isn't as well written, fluff or otherwise.
Georgie told me you'd been kidnapped, my dear. I'm glad to see he was mistaken.
Oh, but it was true. If it hadn't been for Georges, I wouldn't be here now.
Most of the time it's harmless, but sometimes it's pretty annoying.
Look at this. An article about a total eclipse of the sun.
Oh, yeah? Listen, I don't want to be rude, but it just comes naturally. I really don't care.
The dramatic moments can be very cringeworthy.
It was the stone they were after.
Oh my god, you mean I could be in danger too?
And the jokes feel extremely forced.
For a lovely lady, I would go to the ends of the earth. For you, I will go as far as the pyramid and back.
There are also many conversations that are way too cartoony. Take this scene for example. George wants to take a look at Bronson's plans, but Bronson won't let him. He asks George why he's so interested in the plans anyway, and George tells him he always wanted to be a surveyor. Bronson was on the verge of believing him, but George had to go and ruin it by exaggerating.
Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama, Chris Columbus. Maybe you don't sail uncharted seas or discover new continents, but you're okay in my book.
Making it obvious that he was lying. Or how about this scene where Nico is supposed to distract the general, yet she openly complains about it right in front of him.
I'll get you for this, Georges Stobart.
Don't worry. If you're gone for more than a couple of hours, I'll come and get you.
A couple of hours?
There's also this unbelievable scene where George talks to some present-day Mayans who won't allow him to talk to the shaman without offering a tribute. You present a box of dog biscuits and the shaman likes them, but not enough to allow you in. The guards refuse to take the Mayan stone because they think it's cursed. So the only way to see him is to put the Mayan stone inside the empty box of dog treats and trick the guards into taking the stone to him. I mean, ignoring how questionable this scene is, it just doesn't make sense. Wasn't this supposed to be a prophecy? Like, did the shaman never tell his guards, hey, listen, if a white guy comes here holding an obsidian stone with a coyote drawn on it, how about you let him in, huh? I'm gonna deviate a bit here and talk about the conversation system. Much like the first game, the conversation system is based on icons that represent the topic you can talk about. However, unlike the first game, you can't talk about every single inventory item you have. You can only talk about specific inventory items which vary depending on who you're talking to. In theory, this should mean that there's no extra fluff, but that's not the case because most of these items offer only fluff.
I have these very exotic panties.
Take them away, you pervert!
Instead of having a bunch of humorous responses that you can find out on your own by taking the time to ask about these items, this time the developers picked the quote-unquote funny ones for you.
Would you like a biscuit?
No, thank you.
You should, they're good. I can't get enough of these things.
This makes the humorous responses feel very forced.
What do you think of these panties, General?
Oh boy, fabuloso!
They're yours if you'll tell me all you know about Karzak.
I told you, I never heard of the guy. Do I get the panties now? I told you all I know.
It's like they were so proud of their jokes, they wanted to make sure that you don't miss them.
It's the real thing. Knocked my girlfriend out cold in a matter of seconds.
Romantic. Sounds like a real close relationship you have going.
Speaking of which, the game can't go 5 minutes without cracking a joke, and it gets extremely frustrating sometimes.
Is your name really Haiku?
Yeah. It was my mom's idea, okay? When I was born, I was so small and perfectly formed I reminded her of a Japanese poem.
Well, I guess it could have been worse. She could have called you Limerick.
That's my middle name.
Shadow of the Templars had brilliant jokes that were subtle, funny, and few and far between. It took its time with its jokes, resulting in jokes that felt more natural.
Oh, don't shoot. I'm innocent. I'm an American.
Can't make up your mind, huh?
The jokes in Smoking Mirror are set to rapid fire.
Would you like a gourmet dog snack biscuit?
I would love one, senor, but I would have a problem with my teeth.
Toothache?
No, senor. If the general catches me eating on duty, he'll knock them out.
Every other line has to be a joke of some kind, and it gets so exhausting.
Hey, get out of there.
You know, wherever I go, I hear those words. Paris, Syria, Ireland, or Spain. Makes no difference.
It makes the game feel less like a deep adventure game and more like a cartoon. And not a good one, by the way. Just watch this scene. It will give you a good example of the level of humor in this game.
Excuse me?
Huh? Who's there?
I will admit, however, that I was quite impressed with how dynamic the dialogue can be.
You there? What are you doing?
Pardon me, ladies. I was just going to climb your ladder.
I think not. Get your cheap thrills elsewhere, you American.
Some lines may vary depending on what you do before you start a specific conversation.
You there? What are you doing?
Pardon me, ladies. I was just going to climb your ladder. I'm helping Bronson.
Oh, you're not like him, are you? He's very polite, isn't he, Frost?
To give you another example, this is what happens if you pick up the statue before you help Nico.
Hold still. This might hurt a little.
Ow!
Think yourself lucky you don't have a mustache.
About time. You could at least have helped me before grabbing everything you could find.
Not so loud. They'll hear you.
Get these ropes off me right now.
You know, the mood you're in, maybe that's not such a good idea.
And this is what happens if you help Nico before you pick up the statue.
Hold still. This might hurt a little.
Ow!
Think yourself lucky you don't have a mustache.
Thank God it's you, Georges. How did you find me?
I'll explain later. We have to get out of here.
So if there's one thing I can wholeheartedly praise about the writing in this game, it would be how dynamic the conversations can be. The voice acting is also a step down and doesn't do much to make the writing any better.
Sure, I'm having a party to celebrate it. Drop by.
Really?
Sure. Plenty of food, plenty of wine, and everyone's invited, except the general.
I guess it's not unbearable like voice acting in other games I won't mention, but it's still nowhere near as good as the voice acting in Broken Sword 1.
Hey, you make any more noise, I break your arms.
That bully needed to be taught a lesson.
Garzak's already mad because we didn't get the stone. You give me any trouble, I'll tell him it was all your fault.
Most of the acting is bland and uninteresting, making it seem like the actors just didn't care.
Of course. My friends have a boat ready to take me upriver. But how are you going to break out of here with just a short piece of rope?
Is this really how you're going to act out your death scene?
You? It was you? You bastard! You monster! For the love of God, Garzak!
Is this really how you're going to react to your life's work being destroyed?
The pots are insured, but not the shelving. You've no idea how much that cost me. I hope to God Ubier has plenty more of these pots at the docks. If not, I'm ruined.
Is this really how you're going to bark your orders at your subordinates?
You idiot! Not them! The other American and the French woman! They're the ones!
Even the new voice actress who voiced Nico, Jennifer Karen Hall, wasn't that good, and her French accent wasn't convincing at all.
I'd set it up to act as his courier, and once I had the proof, I planned to go straight to Inspector Mou. But instead of the dope I'd expected, they sent me that stone instead.
She's not the only character who got a new voice. All returning characters, save for George, had their voices changed, and honestly, I think they all sound worse than they did in the first game.
Who knows? So little knowledge of what really happened remains. Oh, if it does, the truth has never been made public. The Templars have attained mythological status, like the King Arthur of the Britons.
South or Central American, I'd say. I have a friend who'd be able to tell you more.
Where can I find this guy?
He owns a gallery on the left bank, the Gliese Gallery.
You have seen the Parisian traffic, no?
Yeah, so?
I could direct the traffic. The most dangerous, the east side of Rome. Or I can sit here and enjoy the sun, the architecture, and the Sauvignon.
Orphanage supplied fast food chain?
No, it's the article above that.
Oh! Total eclipse of the sun. Well, that's very dull in comparison. I don't know anything about eclipses.
Me? Oh, a gentleman's interest is always so flattering. Well, my husband and I run a greetings card company in a cute little place called Akron in Ohio. Because he's an old spoil-sport sourpuss. I want to visit one of those old pyramid places, but Dwayne says he has to stay in town.
Right. And you don't want to go on your own.
Well, there's no point in going to the pyramid if there's no one around to take my picture.
At least George is still voiced by Ralph Saxon, who did another great job.
I glanced over the books, vaguely hoping to find a copy of How to Deal with Poisonous Spiders While Tied to a Chair. No such luck. But I noticed one corner of the bookcase was supported by a loose block of wood.
The game has beautiful visuals and wonderful music, but sadly it has an unambitious story and mediocre writing. So far, the game feels more like an Indiana Jones sequel and less like a Broken Sword sequel. Which, by the way, is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not a huge fan of Indiana Jones' story and writing, but I do love its gameplay. So how's the gameplay in this one? Well, first off, let's take a look at the improvements in the gameplay mechanics over the first game. You can double-click on exits to move there immediately. The game only has 4 instances where death is possible, and all 4 of them are fair and provide ample warning, giving you a good chance to save before you take any action. Hotspots have labels now, making it easier to know what you're interacting with. This is pretty helpful to counter the game's pixel hunting, which is back with a vengeance. The best part about this is that you can turn off the labels if you want to. This next mechanic isn't necessarily an improvement, but it's not a step down either. I just thought I'd like to mention it before moving on to the game's puzzles. Unlike in Broken Sword 1, which gave you a bit of freedom onto where to go next, Broken Sword 2 is much more linear. You don't get to go to the next area until you completely finish everything in this current area. You also never revisit areas you've already completed unless it's part of the story. This is certainly simpler than how it was in the first game, but I'm not sure I can call it worse. On one hand, you don't have much of a choice on where to go next, which feels a bit restricting. But on the other hand, Broken Sword 1 never really took advantage of this freedom, so after playing this, I didn't feel like the game was missing this feature. It just didn't need it. Anyway, that's all I have to say about the game's mechanics, so what about the puzzles? Well, I feel a bit conflicted. See, almost none of them made any more sense than the towel puzzle in Broken Sword 1. However, I quite enjoyed solving them. I think the best way to explain how the puzzles work in this game is to show you all the puzzles in the first area of the game, which consists of Oubier's house, the cafe at Montfaucon, and the Glees gallery. You start the game off at Oubier's house, tied to a chair in a burning room with a dangerous spider eyeing you. You look at the bookcase and George will notice that the bookcase is supported by a wooden block. You kick that block and the bookcase squashes the spider. Next, you need to deal with the fire. You find a siphon, but it ran out of gas. You need to refill it by using a CO2 cylinder you find in this cabinet. You use the dart to unlock the cabinet. Sorta. Now you need to get out of the house, but the main door is locked. You find the key inside a small pot you found in the room you were previously trapped in. But George won't leave without a plan. You find a note in Nico's handbag written by Lobino, so you call him in the hopes of finding a lead. On to Montfaucon. Nothing really happens here, you just talk to this retired gendarme and talk to the waiter, then Lobino shows up. He tells you of the Glees gallery, so you go there to find another lead. Here, you can talk to Glees himself and a critic named Lane. Glees ends up being useless, so you need to find a lead on your own. You can find one on his boxes, but he won't let you anywhere near them. You need to distract him. You do so by stealing the gendarme's absence-filled flask and add some of it to Lane's wine, which causes him to pass out and smash Glees's display shelves, giving you the chance to look at the boxes in the back area. At this point, we learn about flags. Finding this sticker on its own isn't enough. You also need to find Oubier's bank statement and learn from Glees that Oubier is his main supplier. You can't move to the next area without doing all these three things. That's basically how most of the puzzles in this game work. I'm just torn on how I feel about them. There are puzzles that I genuinely liked, such as the barrel puzzle in Marseille and the air pump puzzle in the jungle. But I can't point to a single puzzle that I thought was as good as the fake key puzzle in Broken Sword 1. At the same time, I also can't think of a single puzzle that I thought was bad, let alone as bad as the goat or the plaster statue puzzles in the first game. Well, there is one that I really didn't like, but we'll get to that one later. It felt like the devs were more concerned about making puzzles that are fun to solve than ones that make sense. And honestly, I don't mind this at all. At first, I couldn't figure out why I was so hard on Broken Sword 1's puzzles for not making sense, but I don't feel the same way about the ones in this game, even though they probably make even less sense. But after some thought, I was able to rationalize my feelings and sort them into 3 reasons. First of which is the story. Broken Sword 1's story was so serious and engrossing that every time I encounter a nonsensical puzzle, it would take me out of the experience. In this game, however, the story was mindless fun and it didn't take itself seriously. That alone made me not expect too much sense from its puzzles. The second reason is that they never broke the game's rules like the goat puzzle did, and they never wasted my time like the towel puzzle did. The third reason was that the game always made sure that you have all the things you need to solve the puzzle. It might ask you to suspend your disbelief a bit, but it never expects you to stab in the dark, looking for a solution to a puzzle you don't even know is there. To explain my point, I will be comparing my least favorite puzzle in Broken Sword 2 with the towel puzzle from Broken Sword 1, which, let me remind you, was not my least favorite puzzle in that game. You need this marker at the end of a flagpole, however there's no way to get to it. You need to find a way to knock it down. You want to get this cat's ball, but it won't let you, so you go to a local fisher boy and ask him to catch a fish for you. At first, he catches a broken bicycle wheel, but he eventually catches a fish. You give the fish to the cat, but it gobbles it up in a second, not giving you enough time to get the ball. So instead, you tie this rubber tube that you took off the broken wheel to the end of a flagpole, then tie the fish to that tube, making it dangle in front of the cat. Now you can get the ball. However, if you try to use it to knock down the marker, George says that he doesn't have the throwing strength to knock it down. Instead, you need to use this rubber tube on this Y-shaped branch to make a giant slingshot. You use the ball on the slingshot and knock down the marker. This puzzle makes no sense for so many reasons, one of which is how the cat eats the first fish you give it in just a second, yet if you give it the fish the right way, it spends ages eating it. However, even though this is my least favorite inventory-based puzzle in the game, it still didn't bother me at all. I know I need that ball, even if I didn't know why. It's red, it's eye-catching, and I really wanted it. I know there's a fisher nearby who's willing to sell me a fish, so I know that I can use that to distract the cat long enough to get the ball. Rio catches the rusty wheel right in front of my eyes, so it's impossible not to want to inspect it. When George said he doesn't have enough strength to knock down the marker, I immediately thought, wait, can I use that obvious Y-shaped branch to make a giant slingshot? I thought that because I already had something in my inventory that would make this giant slingshot idea doable. The game made sure I had everything I needed, making figuring out the solution quite satisfying. The towel puzzle doesn't do that. You don't know that there's a sink in the cellar. You don't know that breaking this switch will stop the pumps from working. If you've already ordered beer before, you won't think of ordering it again, because you'd be like, why would I do that? It did nothing the first time around. It's also very easy to miss the wire needed to fix the washing machine and the towel needed to get the water to the dig site. The game didn't give you everything you needed to solve this puzzle. You need to frantically look around, exploring every possibility, only to find out that the actual solution is the stupidest out of all the possible ones. In fact, after replaying Broken Sword 2 for this video, I found something that proved to me how consistent this game is with making sure you have everything you need. If we look at every item that you need to solve a puzzle, or to progress the story, only one item can be missed. This dead worm you find in a tequila bottle. You find it at Ubier's house and you use it much later in the game. If you go to Marseille without taking it, there is no way to go back to get it, and you need it to get Rio to give you a fish. Without the fish, you can't go forward. So you'd think that not getting it would mean you'll reach a dead end, right? Well, apparently the devs thought of that and provided quite an interesting solution. If you don't take the worm, you can give Rio the lipstick, something he wouldn't accept if you had the worm. There's no way to go out of Ubier's house without getting the lipstick, as it was in the same handbag as the nylon panties and the letter from Lobino, both of which are necessary to get out of Ubier's house. But wait a minute, before going to Ketch's Landing and meeting Rio, you can actually give this lipstick to the shaman. So does that mean you'll hit a dead end? No, it doesn't. If you didn't have the worm and you didn't have the lipstick, Rio will accept the nylon panties instead. And there's no possible way to reach this point without finding the panties, and there's no way to lose it before meeting Rio. The game is doing all it can to make sure that you have everything you need. Because of these reasons, I found myself having a lot more fun solving the puzzles in Broken Sword 2 than the ones in Broken Sword 1. Does that mean that I think the gameplay in 2 is better than 1? I don't know. I mean, it's not like 2 didn't have its own issues. For example, I did not enjoy my time in Quaramonte as it was pretty boring as far as gameplay goes. There were no puzzles in that area. It's all just flags. You go around, talk to people, exhaust all conversation options until something important happens. I especially disliked this part. George gets imprisoned and says that it's all up to Nico now. This is the first time you ever get to play as Nico. However, instead of having a fun puzzle here to get George out of prison, you just look at everything in the general's apartment, then talk to him about them until his mother arrives, at which point control goes back to George, who ends up escaping without the help of Nico. To me, this was quite disappointing. The first time we get to play as Nico and it ends up being a chore. They could have at least given us the chance to impress his mother on our own instead of making Nico do it automatically. Throughout the game, you only get to play as Nico in 5 areas. The General's apartment, which as I said was completely pointless, the London Museum, which has only one extremely simple inventory-based puzzle, the abandoned subway, which has a couple of extremely simple inventory-based puzzles, the docks, which I'll admit was quite interesting as you get to sneak around and you get to stab Karzak in the leg, which was pretty badass. And finally, Tezcatlipoca's temple. The first half of this section was good. With the help of Titipoco, you find a way to make this lift work in order to go to the top of the temple. And this time you actually get to save George in the most awesome way. The second half, on the other hand, was awful, all because of this one puzzle. You have 2 giant rotating discs with images on them, a wall full of pushable panels that also have images on them, and 4 more panels with even more images on them. The images on each of these panels is a combination of an image on the right disc and an image on the left. In order to push a specific panel in, you need to set the 2 discs at the appropriate images. To open the door, you need to push in all 4 of these panels. These ones have a combination of the images of 2 of the 10 panels. So in order to push each one of them in, you need to push the 2 panels that it corresponds with. That means you need to push in 8 out of the 10 panels, which means you need to move each disc a total of 8 times. I hate this puzzle. It is so time consuming and it's extremely boring. Thankfully, there is a way to skip it. If you click on this ridiculously hard to find pixel, Nico does something, which opens the door without solving the puzzle.
A wiggle. Et voilà!
And that's Broken Sword 2. It might not be as good as the first game, but I thought it was a pretty good game. Sure, the story was bare bones, the writing was mediocre, and the voice acting was a step down. I still found myself enjoying this game nonetheless. The visuals are beautiful, the music is excellent, and I think the gameplay in this game is better than that of Broken Sword 1. Even though the team had significantly less resources to make this game, they were still able to bring out a fun adventure game with an entertaining story. And I'm happy that despite Version's stupid decisions, this game sold pretty well, because it honestly does deserve it. If you enjoy point-and-click adventures, you can't go wrong with this one. Whether you're a fan of the first game or not, you will definitely find something to like in this game. Just like with the previous game, you can get this one by buying the remastered version on Steam and downloading the original as a free DLC, or buy the remastered version on GOG and download the original from the extras. However, unlike the previous game, I will not be criticizing the remastered version, as I think it's quite good. Sure, it has some of the issues the director's cut had, such as the ugly character portraits, the boring speech bubbles, and the lack of an actual widescreen mode. But this time around, the game actually looks as good as, if not better than the original. And since there were no additions to the story and no new puzzles, you'll be getting the same exact experience as you would have if you played the original, with the added bonus of having highlighted hotspots and a hint system. I'm quite happy with this remaster, and I think Revolution did a pretty good job with it. They even fixed many of the nitpicks I had with the director's cut, although they made a mistake that I will never understand. See, in Broken Sword 1, you could not instantly exit a room. However, in Broken Sword 2, you can. In the director's cut of Broken Sword 1, they added this feature. but they removed it from Broken Sword 2's remaster. How did this happen? How do you add a feature to the remake of a game that didn't have said feature, then remove it in a remaster of a game that did have it? It just boggles my mind how they missed this. Still, the remaster was pretty good. You're still better off playing the original on ScumVM, however, if you play this version, you won't be missing out on much. There's even a nice little Easter egg in the remastered version, which I won't spoil. Here's a hint though. It's in this area. It also has a comic made by Dave Gibbons, which explains some of the backstory of Broken Sword 2, so you can check that out if you want to. It doesn't look any better than the Broken Sword 1 comic. Anyway, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoy my videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Even a single dollar would make all the difference. And if you don't want to make any commitments, you can just buy me a coffee. Although, let's be honest, we all know I'm gonna spend that money on goat armor instead. Join me next time as we take a break from Broken Sword and look at Revolution's first 3D game. Thank you for watching.